Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Exploring the Intersections of Culture, Disability, and Identity, our dynamic two-day virtual conference. My name is Travis Davis. I'm a disability advocate and podcast host, and I have the honor of guiding you through these amazing and inspiring sessions over the next 2 days. Before we begin, I want to thank United Cerebral Palsy for hosting this incredible event and give a special shout out to our sponsors, Anchor, Source America, and Waymo, whose generosity has made this conference completely free for all of our participants. This conference is a celebration of diversity, amplifying voices and exploring the intersections between culture, disability, and identity. Whether you are a self-advocate, a family member, an educator, service provider, or a valued ally, we are so glad that you are here to learn, connect, and grow with us. Now, before we dive in, just a few announcements. This event will run from 1 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time today and tomorrow. So please note that all of our times are Eastern Time. The conference will be held in English. We are pleased to offer closed captioning in English or Spanish. To access, select Show Captions from the Zoom menu and select your preferred language. We also have a live Spanish interpretation available. To listen to our presentation in Spanish, select Interpretation from the Zoom menu and select Spanish. If you have any questions today or throughout the event, please feel free to use the Q&A function, or you can email us. Our contact information is in the chat. Now, to kick things off, I'm thrilled to introduce UCP's President and CEO, Armando Contreras, for a few words.
Travis, thank you so much. And also thank you for your support for several years with United Cerebral Palsy and being that advocate for many in the United States. So I'm honored that you're part of this virtual conference. So good morning to everybody on the West Coast and good afternoon if you're in the East Coast. It's an honor to join you today as both the president and CEO of this incredible organization and as a proud member of the Latino community. United Cerebral Palsy is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting individuals with cerebral palsy and other disabilities. Through our affiliate network in the US and Canada, we serve approximately 200,000 individuals with various disabilities, providing vital services and notable programs that promote independence, accessibility, and inclusion. Furthermore, we focus on research that includes early intervention and early detection. We also provide resources to our network and advocate in Washington, D.C., where I spent a significant amount of time in the halls of Congress. Thank you for joining us for this important virtual conference dedicated to Latinos with disabilities and the direct service professionals who serve our community. For me, today is about more than just a professional commitment, it's personal. I grew up witnessing firsthand the resilience and the spirit of our community in the barrio of East LA. And I also saw the extraordinary barriers among us, and especially from my own family when it comes to disability. We don't often talk about these intersecting identities, but they are so very real. And it's time we change the narrative. Our community is vibrant and diverse, not just in language or culture, but in lived experience. Yet too often, Latinos with disabilities are overlooked or underserved. Systemic barriers, whether language, access to healthcare, education, transportation, or cultural stigma, can create feelings of isolation and invisibility. That's the reality we must confront. But we are not here to recount challenges. We are here to envision solutions, to build bridges, and to create a future where having a disability is seen not as a limitation, but as a source of strength and pride. I'm also passionate about this topic because I know the Latino community is blessed with talent, courage, and dreams, and nobody should be left behind because of their disabilities. I want to thank our partners, our advocates, and most of all, the individuals with lived experience who are sharing their stories and expertise during this virtual conference. Your courage to speak up and to show up paves the way for lasting change. Let us use this time in the next couple of days to learn and to lift up every voice. Let's leave the conference not just inspired, but empowered with concrete ideas and energy to walk together as one community. Together, we can transform not only services and policies, but attitudes and mindsets. As we begin these next 2 days together, let's keep in mind that equity is not something to be granted or negotiated. It's something every individual deserves. A special thanks to our sponsors, Waymo, Source America, the Ancor Foundation, and also a deep appreciation to my team, Carrie Cantrell, Director of Affiliate Relations and Programs, for her unwavering leadership on this event, and Andres Atesiano, a committed and passionate volunteer who shared his interests to help us with this special conference. Also, Alexis Sanchez, Development Coordinator. You'll hear more about her, and I believe she's part of the panel. Sarah Piper, Marketing Manager, Pam Norman, Director of Development, and again, our notable MC, Travis Davis. Last, a shout out to James Garcia, with whom we brainstormed this event about 5 years ago, and together we made it a reality. James, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for your commitment, your passion, your belief in a more inclusive future for all of us. Bienvenidos a todos, bendiciones, and welcome to UCP's Latino with Disabilities Conference. Back to you, Travis.
Wow. Thank you so much, Armando. That was great. Loved hearing that from you. So thank you again. Um, Now to kick things off, I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Elisa Flores, who will present Nosotros, Nos Cuidamos, Collective Care and Our Fight for Disability Rights. A bit about Elisa. She is a certified rehabilitation counselor, and her experiences and identities have continued to shape her work. During her career, Elisa has worked as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, community integration specialist, on a transition team in the K through 12 setting, and as an accessibility specialist, assistant director of disability services, and access advocate in higher education. Elisa is passionate about creating spaces that are equitable, inclusive, and accessible for all. Please join me in welcoming Elisa Flores.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you to United Cerebral Palsy for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit more about myself and my work with this presentation. I'm really honored to be here and to share space with you all. Just working on pulling up my slides here. Give me one moment. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes,
Just
it
for
looks
everybody
great.
in the chat.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody, for your patience as I was getting some of these slides pulled up. As I was introduced, my name is Elisa Flores. My pronouns are she, ella. And as a visual description of myself for anyone who may be blind or low vision that's attending this conference today, I am a light-skinned Latina woman that has a white shirt that has some pink and blue design for Hispanic Heritage Month, and I'm also wearing a black blazer as well. I am wearing earrings that are handmade with rainbow colors, and I have short brownish blondish hair as well. As mentioned in my introduction, I have been working with individuals with disabilities both in education and employment. And I also identify as an individual with an invisible disability who is not only Latina, but also part of the LGBTQ community as well. And so, really thinking about the intersections of my own identity has really inspired my work to truly advocate for individuals with disabilities in order for them to gain equal access and equitable spaces and inclusion as well. When thinking about developing this presentation, Nosotros nos cuidamos, or we take care of each other, I really had to think about the state of our country and what we are experiencing, what individuals who also hold multiple identities are facing in this very moment, in this huge drastic political shift. Now, the point of this presentation is to show that even though we have experienced many different political changes and different social movements over time, I want us to reflect about what we have done in order to come together as a collective in order to inspire collective liberation for all, and what that has looked like to fight for disability rights and continue our fight for disability rights. And so in this presentation, some of the things that I will talk about, as I mentioned, it's important for us to take a look at our past in order to move forward to the present. So I'll talk a little bit about a disability rights timeline in general, just so that we can get acclimated to the topic. Then I'll move into the civil rights movement and how that social movement really inspired and impacted the disability rights movement. And then I'll take a look beyond that, right? Now that we have fought for disability rights, how can we move from disability rights to applying a disability justice approach? And then taking all of what we have learned, using that as a blueprint to move forward and continue our fight, especially right now more than ever. Now, in order for us to understand a little bit more about disability rights and where they came from, it's important to understand that though disability rights and advocacy started in the early 1800s, where we see the invention of Braille in the beginning of the 1800s, And we see the establishment of Gallaudet University, which was established in 1864 and funded by President Lincoln during that time. A lot of the progression that was happening in the 1800s came to a stall because there were multiple factors that contributed to it. So the first was society's view of the disability community during this time. Now, during the 1800s, still many disabled people were forced to undergo sterilization, and we were during a time where we still were focused on the eugenics movement, and many individuals with disabilities were forced into institutions and asylums where they spent many of them spent their entire lives. And later, in 1867, we also see the establishment of the ugly laws. This law prohibited people with disabilities from being seen in public, which was a direct target to poor and working class disabled people. And so we see that even though we start the 1800s with some sort of advocacy for disability rights, there are still a lot of societal views, attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions of disabled people that impacted our ability to move forward. Now, as we move to World War I, during this time, from a political context, we start to see a rise in nationalism amongst many countries that leads to tension and competition and leads for the United States to enter World War I. Now, when soldiers had went to fight in World War I, there were about 200,000 soldiers that returned with either permanent physical or psychological disabilities. Now, with these new soldiers that were returning from war, many of them with these new disabilities, the United States needed to find ways in which these disabled veterans could then contribute to society and be reintegrated with their new skills and abilities. So this is where we see the federal legislation of the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917, which established federal funding for vocational education in public schools, and the Fess-Smith Act of 1920, which created the first federally funded program to assist individuals with disabilities. And so during this time, there was a huge focus on rehabilitation, independence, and vocational training for disabled veterans, which then leads to the establishment of the Disabled Americans Veterans Organization, who fought to advocate for the welfare and rights of disabled veterans. Now, it's important to know that even though there were some of these advances that were happening during this time, it's important to note who reaped the benefits of getting access to these training programs and rehabilitation services. Now, during World War I, we see that the majority of veterans that were able to access these services that were established during this time and access organizations like the Disabled American Veterans were white military members. And so that sees a trend as we progress through World War I. It's important to understand that even though there were significant advances when it came to disability rights for veterans, that these were not equal. And still, systemic racism in the military exacerbated discriminatory practices where people of color received inferior medical care, education, rehabilitation, and compensation compared to their white counterparts. Now, as I have already addressed, even though we have seen these advances exist, where we have a lot of federal legislation that has helped veterans with disabilities, it's important to note this differentiation that exists between white service members and people of color that served in the military during this time. And now we continue to see, right, as we move down the disability rights timeline, that even as veterans and people with disabilities are gaining access to more rights and benefits, we see a different story for individuals with disabilities who identify as people of color. Now, by the time the United States entered World War II, again, even though we see the creation of the National Federation of the Blind, we have things like the Social Security Act that's established, the National Mental Health Foundation, and even the president during this time establishes the National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week. We see that there is still this disproportionate treatment that continues where we still see secretary military units denied or reduced benefits with the GI Bill for veterans of color, segregated and redlining laws that affect housing for people of color, especially for folks that were trying to access affluent neighborhoods during this time, less access to medical care and employment opportunities, and exclusion from higher education. And so it's important to know that while there was a lot of great things that were happening on a federal level, it's important to note that these were not equal resources and benefits that benefited all individuals with disabilities. And especially when we consider World War I and World War II, not all of these benefited veterans with disabilities, who a lot of these programs were established originally for. Now, because I have mentioned some of the disproportionate treatment that had existed for Black and Latino veterans during this time, Black and Latino veterans started to challenge the systemic racism and segregation they faced. So in this picture that we see here on the screen, someone that isn't mentioned much in this fight, right, for equal rights, is Dr. Hector P. Garcia, a Mexican-American World War II veteran and civil rights activist who founded the GI Forum in 1948 in Corpus Christi. Now, this establishment of the GI Forum was to combat the discrimination Mexican Americans faced in employment, education, and access to veteran benefits. And this organization really marked a turning point in the late 1940s for us when we talk about equity and equality, the push for that in education. And so, to quote Dr. Hector P. Garcia, education is our freedom, and freedom should be everybody's business. And it's important to think about that specific quote because in a couple of years later, we see a really impactful case, the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, where schools are found separate but not equal is found unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment. Now, this decision served as a significant catalyst for the civil rights movement by challenging segregation and calling for equal rights. So as we see folks like Dr. Hector P. Garcia advocating for people of color to get access to employment, access to education, access to healthcare, a couple of years later, we see this push for equal rights and civil rights that we see happened with the Brown versus Board versus Education. And we also see its impact and served as I mentioned, its impact when we talk about the civil rights movement in general. Now, to provide some additional context, what was going on during this time period, as I mentioned, the civil rights movement gained momentum due to the racial segregation and discrimination that existed in our country, including things like the Jim Crow laws. Now, the civil rights movement has often been described as the greatest mass social movement in modern history that has fought to end racial segregation, discrimination, the right to vote, and have equal protections under the law. It was people-powered, strategically organized, and led to two prominent legislative victories in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, what the civil rights movement had taught us was the importance of grassroots organizing with strategic planning, alliances with different perspectives, the importance of having strong and diverse leadership at the table, and to have resilience among its people. Now, this collective strength and unity served as a model for the social movements that would come after it and inspire the next generation of leaders in the fight. Now, it's important to note that while the civil rights movement is happening to dismantle segregation and discrimination on the basis of race, we also see another movement start to happen during this time, where we see the rise in the independent living movement, which started in Berkeley, California, and eventually led to the center, establishing the Center of Independent Living. Now, it's important to note that the civil rights movement was so impactful for the disability rights movement because leaders of the disability rights movement were able to learn some of the grassroots organizing, the strategic planning, the alliances and collaboration, and the intersectionality that existed with the civil rights movement to push forth the start of what would be their own disability rights movement. Now, it's important to know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which helped end discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, but it did not make any provisions for people with disabilities. And so, pictured here on the right-hand side of our screen, we have Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts, who were known as the mother and father of the disability rights movement. Now, these two prominent figures were able to push for disability legislation in the years that followed their cases, especially when it came to educational advances for people with disabilities. And not only was it significant when it came to education, but it was also significant when we talk about the 504 historic sit-in, which took place in 1977. But when we also talk about the push for the independent living movement as well. So, as I mentioned, probably the most significant part of the disability rights movement was the historic 504 sit-in of 1977. The 504 protest was sparked by the government's failure to implement Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, the issue was for individuals with disabilities during this time, even though the Rehabilitation Act was put in place in 1973, there was no enforcement of the law, which meant that individuals with disabilities could still be discriminated against but had no way to actually fight or advocate for their rights to actually be heard. And there was no one to actually, um, government agency to actually enforce that law at a higher level. So, because of that, there were a series of protests that happened across the US demanding for enforcement of the law. Now, as all of these protests are existing in 1977, the longest and most significant was the sit-in in San Francisco at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which lasted 26 days. Now, following the rally that existed for the 504 to be signed into law and enforced, 150 people with disabilities occupied the HEW Federal Building and began to climb to the fourth floor where the regional offices were. When activists refused to leave the federal building until their demands were met, government officials tried to remove the activists from the building by cutting off phones, denying them food, water, medicine, and supplies. Now, as I mentioned, this significant sit-in lasted a total of 26 days. And that is a long time for individuals to have been occupying that space without access to phones, food, water, medicine, and supplies. So it's important for us to understand how that sit-in became so successful. And so I think it's important for us to understand that why the 504 sit-in was so successful was because of so many prominent figures, disability rights figures, and an intersectional approach. So here are a couple of the individuals that impacted the success of the 504 sit-in of 1977. Now, as I mentioned, the individual on the screen here, Judy Heumann, was the principal organizer of the 504 sit-in that happened at the HEW building. And she looked to another co-organizer in Kitty Cohn to help her put together a intersectional fight in order and collective organization, collective coalition, so that they can get their message forward. Now, Kitty Cohn, as I mentioned, was a co-organizer in the disability rights movement. She was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy at 15 and used a power wheelchair by her mid-20s. Now, during the 504 sit-in, she secured food and grabbed media attention, but her main focus was focused on the emphasis of the intersection of disability, poverty, racism, sexual orientation, and she believed that cross-movement collaboration was integral to success. And I think that belief in cross-organizational movement and having various voices and perspectives and identities at the table really helped activists during this time really push forward and be able to demand for their rights. Now, moving on, I know I talked a little bit about Kitty Cohn and how she really cared about intersectionality related to disability. And that was very true for another individual that was present during the 504 sit-in. Now, here we have Brad Lomax, a civil rights leader and disability rights advocate that brought together two movements to present a united front in the fight. He founded the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Black Panther Party and worked very closely with an individual who I had previously mentioned, Ed Roberts, to ensure individuals with disabilities had their demands met. Now, during the 504 sit-in, Brad Lomax was so important because having mobilized his fellow Black Panther Party members, they were able to provide the essential food, supplies, and medicine that was needed in order to keep the sit-in alive. And many individuals that were there during the 504 sit-in particularly explained that without the power of Brad Lomax and without his participation and having his intersecting identities really impact his work, um, the HEW sit-in would not have lasted as long as it did. But it wasn't just Brad Lomax, Kitty Cone, and Judy Heumann that really helped make this 504 sit-in significant. But it was also significant by individuals such as the Mission Rebels. Now, throughout the 1960s, San Francisco's Mission District saw a dramatic upswing in grassroots organizing and activism. The Mission Rebels were founded in 1965, and what was important about the Rebels was that they were mostly a group of high school and college age Black and brown people from the Mission District that advocated for job placement and educational programs and were committed to doing activist and community work. So not only do we see prominent figures like Brad Lomax really bring together two movements and his intersectional identities, but we see the greater impact of greater organizations of Black and brown people, such as the Mission Rebels, that were also in the fight advocating for disability rights. Now that we talked about the Mission Rebels, it's also important to also note two other organizations, two organizations that were helpful to the success of the 504 sit-in as well. Now here, pictured here, we have the Butterfly Brigade, or also known as the Castro Street Safety Patrol. Now this was a group of gay men activists in the 1970s that were fierce allies to the disability community and really helped keep the participants that were protesting outside of the HEW building and participants that were protesting within it, keeping them safe during this time. So it's also important to know that with showing these individuals and organizations that came together, that it really was a intersectional fight, a fight of many individuals coming together in order to advance the rights of disabled people. Now, when we talk in particular about Latinos who are prominent in activism, we also know that during this time of the 504 sit-in, we have Cesar Chavez, American labor leader and civil rights activist, part of the United Farm Workers, write a letter in support of enforcing Section 504 as well. And so, as I previously mentioned, without having an intersectional approach and having learned from the civil rights movement, disability advocacy that existed in order to keep the movement forward would have not been possible without having cross-organizational coalition rooted in inclusion and protection from discrimination. Now, in fact, this landmark protest has been the longest occupation of a federal building to date. And it's important to know that this 504 sit-in was also the precursor to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was and is the most important piece of disability legislation that prevents discrimination against individuals with disabilities in areas of private and public life. Now, here, as I mentioned, without the 504 sit in and its impact, we wouldn't have had things like the Capitol Crawl, where over 1,000 disability advocates marched to the US Capitol, and around 60 participants abandoned their wheelchairs and mobility aids to crawl up to the building steps and make sure that the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was signed. So now that we have reflected on some of the limitations in the earlier disability rights timeline and the disability rights movement, we can also acknowledge some of the advances and progress that has happened when we applied an intersectional approach to work, and one that benefits everyone, especially multiply marginalized individuals that did not have access to earlier benefits. So now that what we've learned with disability rights, we now want to move from just disability rights to moving towards disability justice. Now, as I mentioned, the principal organizers for the disability rights movement were mainly focused on individuals who were white and disabled. But now, here, adopting a disability justice framework is now an opportunity for us to take a look at the communities that hold multiple identities and are the most impacted. Now, in order to adopt disability justice, it's important for us to understand the previous disability rights movement. Now, disability justice adopts an intersectional framework, acknowledging that disability intersects with other forms of oppression like race, class, gender, and sexuality. Created in 2005 by Sins Invalid, a collective disabled queer women of color, including Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and Stacy Milburn, it critiques the limitations of the disability rights movement focus on white and non-intersectional experiences. It advocates for a more holistic approach that centers the liberation of all marginalized disabled people and emphasizes interdependence over the myth of independence. And as I previously mentioned, adopting a disability justice framework, especially with the state of our country and the individuals who are most impacted right now, we can now take a look at centering the most historically excluded groups, such as women, people of color, immigrants, and people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community. As we think about disability justice, it's important to focus, and it's important for us to understand that their focus was to decenter able-bodied supremacy and how it is upheld by systems of domination and exploitation, such as colonialism, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and other unequal relationships, and to move just beyond legal protections and to recognize how systems of oppression create unique hardships for disabled people. So now that we have moved from thinking about disability rights to moving towards a disability justice lens, we have to understand that our past, it is important to reflect on our past and what has happened and the people that came together for collective fights and collective vision and grassroots organizing. Now, it's important to note that during the 21st century, where we see a rise in conservatism and fascism and new threats to roll back disability rights and welfare and social programs of disabled people, it is important now more than ever for us to learn from the disability justice principles as a means for understanding and resisting these attacks. And so, in order to understand some of the disability justice principles, it's important for us to know them and recognize them and apply them in this political climate. So, the ones that are listed here as the 10 include intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalistic politic, a commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and the most important, what I feel is the most important, is collective liberation, meaning that no body or mind can be left behind. We can only move together if we want to accomplish the revolution that we require. And so, as we think about some of the impacts and some of the challenges that the disability community is facing right now, it's important for us to address these and name these and come together and figure out ways that we can continue to fight, build a sense of community, and move forward. So when we take a look at things like Medicaid and SNAP benefits, as we know, the one big, beautiful act was passed in July of this year. And we know that this bill will make it challenging for states to fund home and community-based services, affect healthcare in rural communities and access to mental health care, and have a monumental impact on those who are low income, women, seniors, individuals with disabilities who rely on these services the most. While thinking about the impact of its passage, it's important for us to continue to support national, state, and local organizations that do cross-disability work, stay informed, and raise awareness about its importance in our communities and with elected officials. Now, as we take a look at the most impacted identities by current legislation and this current political climate, we also have to consider women with disabilities. As women with disabilities are experiencing increased risk of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence, and as we see current attacks on reproductive rights and decreased access to services with things like the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and things like women being more likely to experiencing poverty and unemployment, it's important for us to continue to do the work to not only advocate for individuals with disabilities, but to also consider the intersecting identities of the disabled community. And so when we talk about things like applying disability justice, when it comes to women with disabilities, we also have to consider how important it is to also stay in the fight when it comes to reproductive justice as well. Now, moving from talking about women with disabilities, it's also important to think about the members of the LGBTQ community that also have disabilities as well. Now, the intersecting barriers of homophobia, transphobia, and ableism have resulted in discrimination in healthcare, employment, housing, and education. The discrimination of LGBTQ plus communities face right now is more prevalent during this political climate. And so it is also important that we continue in the fight to also make sure that LGBTQ individuals with disabilities are centered and we continue to advocate. So I think one of the most important things that is existing right now in our country when it comes to being a Latino with a disability is when it comes to immigration and immigrants with disabilities. Now, we know that according to the Urban Institute, 5.6% of immigrant adults ages 18 to 64 have a disability. And roughly 1 in 3 immigrants with disabilities has limited English proficiency. So it's important to keep in mind that as immigrants with disabilities experience an inaccessible and culturally insensitive immigration system, lack of resources, and at times legal representation or denial of accommodations through the immigration process, increased discrimination and stigma or concern about immigration status and or fear of being detained or deported. It's important for us in our communities to continue to fight back and continue to advocate for Latinos and immigrants with disabilities and continue to do the work in order to make sure that Latinos with disabilities, and in particular immigrants with disabilities, know their rights and make sure that they know their rights in a language that makes sense for their background, whether that is Spanish or whether that is an immigrant from a different country. So we have to make sure that we are not only paying attention to what's going on in our community, but we have to continue to do the work in order to support each other and lift each other up, especially as new legislation comes out and continues its attack on our communities as well. Now, I do leave you, as now we've talked about the disability rights timeline, we've talked about disability rights movement, the civil rights movement, moving from disability rights to a disability justice framework and lens, and the current situations that are impacting our communities the most. I wanted to tie it all together and think about how we can use what we learned today to continue the fight for our communities. Now, it's important for us as so many things continue to happen and challenge our rights and our communities directly, that we apply collective care and take action. Now, what we can do right now and take away from what we have learned before, whether that was individual or organizations that existed before us, and what we can learn from each other, is that we can continue to apply disability principles in our everyday lives. We can seek out and contribute to mutual aid networks that are doing so much great work to help our most impacted communities. We can share mental health resources, resist all forms of oppression, whether that is ableism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and sexism. And we can also continue to build our community and seek knowledge and truth by leaning and learning from one another. And I leave you with some questions to reflect and apply. And all of the participants that are able to be a part of this session, I will leave you with this so that we can continue to apply and do the work that is needed to move forward. My final wrap up to this session is a reminder that we are not free unless everyone is free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for that engaging presentation. I hope you all enjoyed learning from her, and it was such a great presentation. I certainly did. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jose J. Rivera Jr. Jose is the Director of Quality Assurance at Cerebral Palsy Association of Nassau County in New York. With 50 plus years in developmental disability advocacy and inspired by his brother's experiences at Willowbrook, he has appeared in various Willowbrook documentaries and now leads efforts to establish the Willowbrook Center for Learning to honor his brother's legacy and the Willowbrook community. Today, he will be speaking about his personal account of his family's unwavering love and resilience as they confront the profound challenges of caring for his brother Luis in his presentation entitled Familia First, One Latino Family's Journey in Pursuit of Services and Supports. Please join me in welcoming Jose Rivera.
Thank you very much, Travis, certainly for that very nice introduction. Thank you, all of you who are on this conference. I greatly appreciate your time. Certainly thank you to UCP for hosting this event and more importantly for extending the invitation to me to be able to talk about my family, my personal experience as I grew up learning about my brother, who, by the way, is depicted in this picture. That is Luis Rivera, and my mom looking out of the window of the institution that my brother was in for a significant portion of his life. And he's reacting to life outside that window, the very life that the institutions deprived him of. And certainly part of what I want to be able to share with this audience, with the expectation that in sharing with you my personal history, my family's experience, you're able to learn how to navigate some of the challenges that you might be facing yourself as you pursue the rights of your disabled individual, pursue your own rights as a person with disabilities, and an acknowledgement and a right that you have, the government has a responsibility to ensure that your needs are being met. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. Carrie, thank you so much for assisting me with the slide presentation. So I'm going to open it up by just giving you an introduction as to my family, mi familia, comprised of. So my parents, my mother, my father, had 3 boys. I was the firstborn, and as such the oldest, followed by Louis. Louis was born a year later after me, and ultimately Jimmy, the youngest of the 3 boys. Louis was born in Puerto Rico in 1956. He was born by midwife, as my mother recounts and recalls. And Louis maybe should have been born in a hospital because I think there was some struggle that was involved when Louis was being born. And that struggle, my mother always speculated, was possibly the reason why Louis was born with the types of disabilities he was confronted with. That next bullet there is it's just touching on Louis's challenges as my parents noted. He was certainly slow in his development, ultimately being diagnosed as being profound in his level of mental retardation, as they referred to them back in the 50s. My brother also suffered from grand mal seizures. Those seizures, as I remember, were particularly challenging for my parents. Louis slept in between my mom and my dad as their way of controlling and not controlling, monitoring his seizures. And if in the middle of the night, Louis would start to shake and convulse uncontrollably, that was the trigger for them to jump up from bed and rush over to the local emergency room hospital, where they were able to control his seizures through medications. But one of the things that my family continually they were hearing from the medical community was that they had a choice to make. They can either keep Louis at home, in which case he'll probably live a short life with a lot of love of family, of course, or Louis can be placed in Willowbrook State School, this place out in Staten Island that my family, we had no knowledge of. But the feeling was that, according to the experts, that was the place where people with developmental disabilities would be placed and be served. And so in placing Louis there, my parents were led to believe that he would live a longer life, get the services he required, and it would be in his best interest. So with much pain in their heart, my parents in 1961 placed Louis in Willowbrook State School. I say much pain in their heart because I specifically remember that for whatever reason in my head. Now I remember he's 5 when he was placed in Willowbrook. I'm 6. But I remember my parents both coming home on that particular day, and forgive me if I get a little emotional. They each went to a separate room and they cried. They cried because they had recognized that they had given up one of their children, and they had given up one of the most vulnerable children to a state system that they really had no knowledge of. I should point out to this audience that the terms under which you were placed in Willowbrook State School and state institutions like Willowbrook across New York State required that families turn over their rights to state officials. So essentially, these individuals were considered wards of the state of New York, and those are some of the terms that placement in Willowbrook State School required for people like my brother. Next slide, please. One of the things that was most important for us, and a lesson that I've learned and I live with today, my parents believed very strongly that just because Louis was no longer with us at home, did that mean that we would forget that we had a brother that was disabled, or that we had a brother, I should say, period. My parents made it a point of ensuring that every Sunday, my youngest brother, Jimmy, would go with my mom to visit with Louis. And the following Sunday, I would go with my dad. So they would alternate visits on Sundays to ensure, again, that we did not forget that we had a brother who was away from us, but nonetheless a member of our family. It was also a way that they kept abreast of Louis's care and made sure that he was getting what he needed, as they were led to believe. As time went on, what my parents developed, particularly my mom, were particular techniques on assessing and gauging whether Louis was getting the proper care and services. As an example, my mother, whenever she would arrive, the first thing she would do is undress Louis to see if there were any marks and bruises, to determine whether Louis looked healthy, was he gaining weight. I say that because there were no opportunities to have any kind of meetings, discussions, plans for goals, and no reports of progress or lack thereof being shared by state officials. So families were left to fend for themselves and be able to make sure that they were aware of what was going on with their loved one. On a particular Sunday, we happened to go over to see my brother at Willowbrook State School, only to find out that he had been moved. Unbeknownst to the family, families didn't get any notice of the move. But he was transferred to another facility, Lower East Side of Manhattan. Willowbrook was in Staten Island. By the way, my parents lived in the Bronx, for those who are familiar with New York City and its 5 boroughs. And they were told Louis was moved to Gouvernier State School, a building that had been built in 1985, served as a New York City hospital, referred to as Gouvernier Hospital, abandoned in the 1960s because it was a building that was no longer structurally sound and was boarded up and vacated by the city of New York. The state of New York then entered into a lease agreement with city and opened up the building and moved 200 or so individuals from Willowbrook State School into this building that had been vacated by the city. The state was anticipating and dealing with the overcrowded conditions that I'll touch on in my next series of slides, conditions that they were aware would eventually be recognized and result in major litigation against New York State. So the state of New York thought it clever that let's try to see if we can relieve some of the overcrowded conditions. And they chose 200 of the most disabled individuals that were housed in Willowbrook State School. And because of their level of disability, because of their compromised health, the officials believed them to have these individuals to present a short life expectancy. So there was a gamble that the New York State took. They figured this building should never have been rehoused and reopened, but it may be short-lived because the people that we were placing there are not going to live that long. So they took a gamble. They took a gamble. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of the history of Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook State School in the early 1950s became a place where the state of New York was housing people with developmental disabilities. Its census exceeded what it was able to accommodate. There were many more people being placed in Willowbrook State School than those buildings can house. And so what started out as in 1952 as 2,450 individuals, by 1962 had reached 5,229 individuals. So it really almost doubled in the number of people being housed in Willowbrook State School. The combination of overcrowded conditions, further complicated by budget cuts. And budget cuts is a phrase we need to continue to remind ourselves, as our previous speaker touched on. Ms. Flores certainly pointed out how the big so-called beautiful bill is something we need to be prepared to address. Budget cuts is what occurred back in the 1960s and 70s. In turn, staff shortages started to occur in Willowbrook State School. And so the combination of overcrowded, inadequate staffing, and staff shortages certainly led to deplorable conditions, ultimately resulting, as depicted by Geraldo Rivera's famous expose in 1972, where he went in as a result of the two doctors that worked there that could no longer tolerate the intolerable conditions that were occurring in Willowbrook, and allowed them access. And Geraldo went in with his cameras and exposed to the world what Willowbrook had become. That led to a class action lawsuit in 1972, and the lawsuit settled in 1975 with the governor at that time, Governor Carey, acknowledging the need to end warehousing of people with disabilities, and the establishment of what's called a consent decree, Willowbrook consent decree. Next slide, please. The basics for the Willowbrook consent decree was, in my opinion, the framework of a Bill of Rights. The consent decree, as arrived at by the class action lawsuit, those representing the Willowbrook class members that were there, in opposition to the state of New York and how New York State was caring for people with disabilities, forced the state of New York to recognize that individuals with developmental disabilities had basic human rights. And the consent decree spelled out in plain language what New York State's terms were and what they now owed this protected class, referred to as the Willowbrook class clients. Protected class of 5,000 plus individuals who were presently residing at Willowbrook State School or on the rolls of Willowbrook State School in other state facilities, because all the state facilities were suffering similar deplorable conditions. So some of these are key components and part of what help reaffirm what we as families of Lewis and families of thousands of others in New York State were always of the opinion that they had a right to active treatment, individualized care, the right to families to be kept informed. Families, as I described earlier in my earlier slide, were not told anything regarding their loved ones. As a matter of fact, when you visited your child at Willowbrook State School, you weren't allowed to go see the bedroom, see where they were sleeping, see where they were being fed. You had a visitor's lounge and you were restricted to that visitor's lounge. So parents would never know really what was occurring back there. Those wards were locked, secured wards. The right to protection from harm, abuse, and neglect is a core component of what was recognized by the state of New York, because a lot of people passed away in Willowbrook as a result of the negligence that occurred over the years and the mistreatment. Nutritional services were part of what the state of New York was forced to recognize. How sad that a state entity, a government entity would have to be told in writing that people are entitled to 3 square meals a day, nutritious meals. How unfortunate that was where we had gotten to, the mindset that was in place by the leadership, the state leadership at the time. The right to proper medical care and treatment, recreational activities, provision of services and recommendations. And ultimately, this last bullet here was key. The right to live in as normal a setting, least restrictive an environment as possible. Because that particular right is what led to the deinstitutionalization and the closure of Willowbrook State School, and the recognition that people with disabilities had a right to live at home in their communities and be members of the community as we know it, members of society, not isolated and removed and housed somewhere away from society to their detriment. So the consent decree really provided a framework and a reaffirmation of what families knew all along, but was now officially being adjudicated by the judge and by the court system and accepted by the state of New York. Next slide, please. So part of what happened, I'm just backtracking a bit before the class action lawsuit filed. In 1971, with the transferring of a lot of our individuals into Gouverneur, I and my family became involved with the Parent Association. The parent group was formed, referred to as the Gouverneur Parent Association, in response to a threat that New York State was now and sent out letters to families like my mom and my dad, informing them that because of budget cuts, here again it goes the word budget cuts, that Gouverneur State School was no longer receiving the funding that it needed to continue to operate. So in its infinite wisdom, the state officials thought we need to close Gouverneur and transfer those 200 or so, whatever number of individuals were still alive and existing at Gouverneur, back to Willowbrook State School, because we can no longer afford to operate Gouverneur. Gouverneur, by the way, because of its structural deficiencies, had lost its federal accreditation. So New York State was now carrying the full financial burden of the operations of Gouverneur State School. Again, as a result of individuals living longer than what the state anticipated they would. That parent association being organized and led by a parent by the name of Miss Willie Mae Goodman, who continues to be very active today at the age of 94. So I just shout out to Miss Goodman. It is how I became involved. And I served, my parents wanted to know what was going on, and because of their limited ability to speak the language, English, I was asked to serve as interpreter. I would sit in to many of the parent meetings and interpret for my parents as to what the plans were and how the Parent Association was looking to organize, seek community support, political support in an effort to prevent movement, the transfer, because the threat was that the state of New York, the fear would come in the middle of the night with buses, and just like they did when transferring them from Willowbrook into Gouverneur, do the same, transfer them back from Gouverneur without knowledge of the parents or consent back to Willowbrook. So the parents had to strategize and organize, actually making use of a lot of the community support networks like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and local community organizations to help serve as guards, so to speak, and prevent New York State from going ahead and in a very sneaky way, attempting to just remove people without the knowledge of families. And as a result, through the efforts of an attorney who himself was the father of an individual with disabilities, Murray Schneps, we were able to secure the first court injunction preventing our individuals from being moved back to Willowbrook State School. So before the 1972 class action lawsuit being filed, the Gouverneur parents was certainly successful in setting the precedent for what would later become the blueprint that was being followed by the civil rights, New York Civil Liberties Union attorneys as they pursued a larger class action lawsuit on behalf of New York State residents, on behalf of those individuals that were suffering neglect and abuse in Willowbrook State School. So my involvement with the Parent Association allowed me to learn and how to better advocate, gave me knowledge as to what the rights were of my brother, that would later be reaffirmed through the 1975 class action lawsuit that spelled out and provided my brother as now considered a class member and others like him with defined inalienable rights as noted in the Willowbrook Consent Decree. Next slide, please. So from institutions to community-based services, you know, we went from 1971 Gouverneur and now 1991 returned back to the community. Within those 20 years, I wound up continuing in my advocacy, continuing in my efforts to represent my brother's best interest, recognizing that for me to be an effective advocate for Louis, I needed to be an effective advocate for all individuals like Louis Rivera. What starts out as one, advocating for one, becomes an advocacy that I was now undertaking for all. And I think that was important because it helped broaden my perspective, and for me to be able to get good care for my brother, there was a recognition that I was not just fighting for him, I was fighting for those like him in the facility, like Gouverneur State School, and the subsequent facilities that our individuals in Gouverneur were transferred to. So through that experience, I worked for 10 years as a state auditor. That role as a state auditor gave me groundwork entry into the regulations. I felt empowered by having that knowledge. I felt I had the ability now to really advocate for Louis and others like Louis and help family members ensure that the rights as required by law were being guaranteed and being adhered to by the service providers for people with disabilities. But over those years, I also wound up leaving state of New York and worked in the not-for-profit sector in different roles, where I'm currently at with CP Nassau County as Director of Quality Assurance, and continue to make use of what I've learned over my lifetime to help ensure that individuals get what they deserve, what they're entitled to, what they require by way of care and services. In those years, juggling the healthcare needs of someone like my brother became challenging. You know, the state closes institutions down, but the state never really directed the attention that it needed to in terms of the infrastructure. So, for example, the hospitals and the communities weren't as familiar with people with developmental disabilities as they should have been, in large part because these individuals were isolated and removed from communities. So in instances where my brother Louis needed to go to the hospital, doctors oftentimes didn't know what to make of his situation and thought that a lot of his ailments were as a result of his disability, when in fact, It was not. It was not. They were afraid to handle him because my brother looked somewhat frail given his disabilities. And yet it was important for me to reassure them that Louis was strong and Louis was no different than the rest of us, and he should be receiving the same kind of care that he's entitled to as the rest of us. So, and now while being in the community, we were also challenged by the fact that the provider wasn't always confident in having Louis go out into the community and experience community life. So that became another challenge for me as I tried to negotiate and navigate and advocate on behalf of my brother that he should be allowed to experience life as we know it now in the community. Visit the parks, visit the museums, go out to a restaurant, go out to see a movie. I've noted in my slide here, he experienced and enjoyed the New York City Marathon. The fact that, not that Louis ran into the marathon, I would love for that to have been happening, but that was about to have him positioned, because Louis was in a wheelchair, positioned and see the marathon runners run in front of him was something that thrilled him, because with Louis was seeing life before his eyes, a life that he had been denied and deprived for so long. So, transferring someone from the institutions into the community doesn't mean that everything's been achieved. It means that as advocates, on behalf of your loved one, you need to ensure that provider is recognizing the benefits of community living to the fullest and making use of that experience to the fullest extent possible, factoring in certainly health and well-being of the person, but not being so apprehensive as not to want to kind of push the envelope a little bit and allow for that human being to experience life outside the four walls. Next slide, please. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation and certainly wanted to be able to touch on some of what my lessons have been in advocating for my family member. I learned that I don't have all the answers. And it was important for me to, in becoming educated and becoming knowledgeable about how to best advocate for Louis, it was important for me to ask a lot of questions. And asking those questions, I would learn from those that knew more about the needs of people with disabilities than I did, the experts, so-called experts. And in gaining that knowledge, I was able to have a conversation that was based on fact and reasoning, and allowed for me to be respected in my efforts to advocate for behalf of Louis. I think part of what I also learned was that in making our goals clear, what is it that we were looking for Louis? It helped ensure that they understood what our reasoning was. We weren't looking to get into a power play. Oftentimes, when you have these team meetings to plan for someone's life and future goals and aspirations or activities you want to work on with them, there's a sense of power play here. That if you reveal your intentions, I think oftentimes there's an opportunity for that clinician, that team member, that administrator to understand, and in understanding have some buy-in into what it is you're looking to achieve. I always point out to people when we would have our meetings, our team meetings with regards to my brother, that my biggest enemy, our biggest enemy, on behalf of my brother Louis, was the clock on the wall, and the fact that with each passing day, it was one less day that Louis had to enjoy life as we all know it. And it was important for me for people to appreciate that. It wasn't so much about making sure my brother was healthy and well, and as much as it was letting him experience life to the fullest as we knew it. And that which had been deprived, he was deprived of because of institutionalization. So I believe that was important as part of what I learned. I also say to the families and those who were on this conference call, stay informed. Stay active and stay involved. I've this involvement, this profession that I've devoted my past 50 years, if not longer, of my life, is not by choice. This was out of necessity. And once you're in it, you can't. I always say you can't be. You have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. You can't be a part-time advocate. You're either an advocate all the way, or you're not advocating at all effectively. So, staying informed is important. Make sure your elected officials know who you are, know who you represent, know who your interests are about. And in doing so, that elected official recognizes that that person who otherwise does not have a voice has a voice through you, has a voice through you. And I think that's an important, as our previous speaker, Elisa, touched on, the threat of billions of Medicaid dollars being pulled away on a federal level will have state level consequences. And the states will have to absorb that loss of Medicaid funds. And as such, if you're not informed and you're not ensuring that your elected officials are aware of what's going on, and that you have an ear to the grind and are certainly watching what's happening, if you're not making that message known to them, we are allowing for the slippage, and we will be unfortunately losing on what's been achieved over the many years as a result of the sacrifices of advocates, like many of the ones on this call, on this panel. We will lose out on some of those services and supports if we remain silent, if we remain if we're just not active and involved and informed. So with that being said, I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I turn it over. I don't know if there, Carrie, if there are questions, or is that occur at a later time?
So we have some questions. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody did as well. We are very grateful for so many people that have been encouraged by this. So thank you. And we have a few questions. I'll start with the first one. Can you share a specific moment when you felt the system failed your family and how you responded?
Louis, before he was institutionalized in Willowbrook State School, had use of his legs. And by use of his legs, limited, because Louis was always in a wheelchair. So Louis would kick his way around the apartment we lived in the Bronx as a way of navigating the environment. And that was an ability that once placed in Willowbrook State School, Louis lost. Because he wasn't getting the therapies he needed. And so we saw gradual loss of abilities, as was the case not just with my brother, but with hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals. But institutionalization was one quick way of accelerating the disabilities and the conditions that people were struggling against and trying to compensate for. So I feel that the state of New York failed us because they failed in their promise to families like mine when we were led to believe that a placement in Willowbrook State School would be in Lewis's best interest. Lewis may have been better served if he had remained at home with us. So that was a scar my mother and a cross my mother carried with her to her grave. She never, ever got over and always felt guilty at having placed him in Willowbrook State School, as has been the case with thousands of families. They carry that cross, that burden, in feeling that they somehow betrayed their child because they placed their child in a state facility under the guise of that they would get care. And that to me is a part of something my mother went to her grave with. It was always a struggle with. I think in many ways affected my parents that ultimately wound up divorcing. I think it disrupted and affected the marriage. You know, one other lesson that I want to share with those in the audience, there are some families that I ran across in my years of advocacy and fighting for my brother that oftentimes would say to me, you know, the responsibility of advocating and monitoring for my disabled child is mine. I don't want that to be imposed on my other children. I don't want my other children. I don't want the siblings to feel that that's an obligation they need to carry. And I would always be puzzled by that, because I would say to myself, eventually when that father is no longer around, that sibling is the next in line to advocate for that person, to represent that person's best interest. How can that person effectively do that if they weren't involved and become knowledgeable about what that brother or sister requires? So I just felt that that was always a challenge, and one that I struggled to understand why.
Well, thank you for that response. Thank you. What are the biggest gaps that you see in how state or federal programs serve families like yours?
I think the biggest gaps is there's oftentimes a greater challenge in ensuring that there's a partnership that's recognized in advocating for that individual with special needs. That partnership should go hand in hand. Families should be encouraged to contribute to the discussion. Regulations define how often we meet, the topic we're to cover, um, but regulations don't describe how that interaction is to occur. And I've always felt that there are families that sit in during those team discussions feeling intimidated, feeling overwhelmed, feeling outnumbered by the number of representatives that are there in that conversation about their loved one. I took a different approach. I was there and I felt I controlled this conversation on behalf of my brother and my family. And I will be the one agreeing to what we do with him or not. So I think that the federal state system and regulations don't seem to really provide that kind of support. That training the families how to be effective advocates is something we don't do enough of. And I believe that's something that's long overdue. We rely on these other entities like case managers, care coordination organizations to do some of that advocacy, but there's nothing like that bloodline, that family member, that to really ensure that that person's needs are best represented. Not to say that there aren't a lot of good, kind-hearted advocates, care managers, case managers, care coordinators. There are a lot. I've come across a lot of it, genuinely concerned and want to do the right thing by that person with disabilities. But the system doesn't promote and ensure advocacy as it should.
Well, thank you. Another question. Does Willowbrook still exist? Willowbrook School still exist? And if so, what is it like now?
So no, Willowbrook was closed, officially declared closed in 1987. The actual building on Staten Island, the buildings, I should say plural, are now serve as the College of Staten Island. City universities acquired it and converted it into a learning center. How interesting that the grounds where thousands of people were housed is now a place of learning and knowledge. And to the credit of the College of Staten Island, they have partnered with the state of New York, and the learning center that was referenced in your opening remarks and introduction about me is something that the governor, current governor, has supported and will, as I understand it, allocating funds to allow for a learning center that will serve to memorialize the history that occurred on the grounds of Willowbrook State School. And the College of Staten Island certainly will play an integral part in the running of that facility to help ensure that we don't lose that history and not forget where we were, so that we don't make those same mistakes in the future.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. So what would be some of your recommendations for family members whom are afraid to speak up on behalf of their loved ones due to their immigration status?
Yeah, that's certainly of concern currently in light of the current environment. I would make use of that care manager, that social worker, that representative that's there, um, receiving Medicaid funding to represent your loved one. So use that vehicle to help voice and channel your concerns if you are concerned about um, putting yourself out in front, and in doing so, run the risk of um, being identified. Uh, Use those voices that are there to represent your loved one, and make sure, because they're getting paid. They're getting paid, and make sure that that representation is what you want that representation to be. And it's a hard decision to make, but I be there for your loved one. I appreciate the concern and the fear, but your individual family member um, will always need you to be by their side, and I appreciate the concerns in today's times with the threat of deportation, stymieing the ability of family members to be out in the open fighting for their loved one. How sad that we've reached that time. But use the powers that be, use the system that be. You're still that that parent, that father, that brother, that sister, for that loved one. So I hope that that's helpful. Reach out to me and
Yes.
ask me if I can help.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for extending that to all of our attendees today.
I hope I don't regret making that extending that offer.
I'm sure you will not. Well, thank you so much, Jose, for such a powerful presentation. We all enjoyed it. And up next, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Tania Lizarazo. Dr. Lizarazo is the director of the Minor in Critical Disability Studies at UMBC, where she is also associate professor in modern languages, linguistics, and intercultural communication and the Global Studies program. She is a neurodivergent and disabled immigrant from Colombia. Her research has used community engaged methods, mainly collaboration and ethnography and digital storytelling to explore survival, migration, and identity. She is the author of Post-Conflict Utopias, Everyday Survival in Choco, Colombia. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Lizarazo.
Thank you so much, Travis. And buenas tardes, good afternoon, everyone. I am so grateful to be here today. And I really appreciate all of you making time today to talk about disability justice. Many thanks to Alexis Sanchez and Carrie Cantrell for inviting me to be here. And I love talking about disability, and I'm disabled, but this is the first time that I'm talking about disability in a space that is about and for Latinos. So this is amazing for me. And I'm hopeful for an open conversation that imagines the justice we deserve. So feel free to ask a question at any time, and at the end I can answer. But if not, I'll also give you my contact information so we can stay in touch. In the spirit of accessibility, I want to describe myself. A common practice in disability spaces. I'm a youngish, middle-aged Latina with short black hair, wearing round glasses, and a yellow dress with moths, many prints of colorful moths. On the screen, you see the title of the talk, COVID and Disability Justice in Times of Latinx Criminalization, as well as my name and affiliation. The background of this presentation is blue, and every slide has some kind of collage, including dried flowers and also moths as well. In this first slide, there are also illustrations of 5 disabled queer activists of color associated with disability justice as a movement. We have Maria Palacios on the top left from Since Invalid. Next to her are disabled ancestors, Stacey Park Milburn and Patricia Byrne, right here on there. I don't know if you see my cursor, yeah, on the bottom left. Next to her, yeah, and wearing a t-shirt that reads "Disabled and Proud" is Lee X.E. Brown, and on the bottom, Mia Mingus in red. Another common practice in disability spaces is to ask people to share their pronouns and access needs. I know I didn't know my own access needs the first time that I was asked, even though like I've been chronically ill since I was a kid. So instead of sharing publicly, I would also like each of you to ask yourself, what would it look like and feel like to listen to your body? And this is why access notes are very common in disability spaces as well. I know specifically in academia, but in this type of spaces, we think about our brains as disembodied things. And we have internalized a lot of unnecessary ideas about what is professional. And capitalism also forces us daily to ignore our needs. In the process, we forget how to be in tune with our bodies and what we need. So pay attention to your body mind. Are you thirsty? Do you need a snack? What would it be the best way to listen? Standing, pacing, lying down. I know that I have chronic back pain, so I always have a yoga mat for stretching and taking gravity out of the equation. Anyways, feel free to make yourself comfortable and try to be mindful of what you need. I also want to acknowledge that comfort and access are not available to everyone in the same way or to the same degree. It is the case, as many of you know, that most of these events are taking place in occupied lands. So meaning that these places always carry legacies of violence, right? There's an ongoing genocide happening in Gaza. So comfort is not always accessible for everyone. And I also wanted to acknowledge that. And because I'm already asking you to think a lot about a lot of things and do a lot of stuff without you knowing who I am besides my job, let me tell you what in some disability circles are referred as disability pronouns, or the language each person chooses to talk about their embodied experience of disability. So first, I grew up in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm here right now. So that's why you see some pictures of myself as a kid, because this is where the treasure of my childhood live. And I was diagnosed with joint arthritis as a kid, and I have been accumulating many diagnoses since then, including spondyloarthropathy, which was previously known as ankylosing spondylitis, hypermobility syndrome, endometriosis, and adenomyosis, and a long list of things that if anyone wants to talk about chronic illness, I'm all for it at any time. I'm also neurodivergent. And why does this matter? First, a lot of people talk on behalf of disabled people, so I always think it's important to acknowledge when we're disabled and we have like a chronic illness, because that's like a different experience of embodiment. But also, it is important to talk, especially when we talk about COVID and disability justice, that invisible disabilities are often ignored or dismissed. It took me a long time to acknowledge I am disabled, in part because in Latinx and Latin American communities, it is not unusual to reinforce narratives about overcoming illness and disability as desirable. That said, we know everyone can become disabled at any point in their lives, and we will all join this disability, this identity category if we live long enough. And actually, the disability community is the only minority anyone can join at any point in their lives. But we are sometimes too invested in the identity of not being disabled and the denial of our own vulnerability. So that's why today I'm interested in highlighting care as a collective responsibility, and the beautiful collectivism of our diaspora, so we can see beyond the disabled, non-disabled divide as we navigate criminalization and the disabling of our own community members daily. And as I said, I'm in Bogota and I've been experiencing like more masks than ever, and people even like reminding each other like to wear a mask if they have symptoms. And yeah, people are buying masks outside hospitals. There's like little vending machines for buying masks inside, and that is sci-fi for me sometimes. And I want to start with a quote by disabled Puerto Rican writer Aurora Levins Morales that reminds me and reminds us that disability and oppression are intertwined. There is no neutral body from which our there is no neutral body from which our bodies deviate. Society has written deep into each strand of tissue of every living person on Earth. What it writes into the heart muscles of five-star generals is distinct from what it writes in the pancreatic tissue and intestinal tracts of Black single mothers in Detroit, of Mexicana migrants in Fresno. But nobody stands outside the consequences of injustice and inequality. What our bodies require in order to thrive is what the world requires. If there is a map to get there, it can be found in the atlas of our skin and bone and blood, in the tracks of neurotransmitters and antibodies. It gives me chills. So pay attention when we say something is normal or desirable or the way things are. And remind yourself that what makes us think that someone is too disabled or too crazy or too different is not natural. We construct it through our actions and our words and the things that we repeat. So being ashamed of being disabled is participating in our own oppression, being in denial about our own complicity in ignoring what can weaken our community and our own bodies. And our communities will not help us survive together. And I'm sure we have like many examples of how illness and disability have been used as tools of oppression. But there's 4 things that I want to talk about today. We already started talking about disability, but I wanted to take us to the beginning of the pandemic to understand why we decided to throw collective care and solidarity away, and with it, our masks and any precautions we were taking for ourselves and each other. And we'll specifically talk about disability justice and why thinking about disability justice principles can make us and our communities stronger. In times where not only immigration status, but language, class, and occupation can make us vulnerable to kidnapping, incarceration, and deportation, as well as the disablement that comes from COVID and other illnesses that have spread rapidly in detention centers, I want to invite everyone to choose collective care again. I'll end with what now, because it's a question my students ask me a lot, and one I think is important to ask ourselves every day. What to do is collective work. It's not easy, but I hope this is more of a conversation. So again, feel free to write in the Q&A box and share your thoughts at the end or email me later. So pandemic times. There's many narratives and experiences of the pandemic, so I just briefly want to invite you to remember the ideas of we're in this together and collective care. For a moment in 2020 and 2021, at least for me, I experienced the possibilities of like what we could do together if we prioritize accessibility and care. I love knowing that we were constantly thinking about what we owed each other. How did care feel like for you? How did you care for yourself and your community? And just to describe what is happening, I added some other elements to the background and the collage that we have going on, an N95 mask, a COVID test. And of course, what you're seeing here is many headlines from 5 and 4 and 3 years ago, in the many ways in which solidarity showed up in the everyday. from singing together to wearing masks to fundraising. But of course, these times of global crisis and solidarity also brought terrible suffering for communities of color. For the Latin American diaspora in the US in particular, we went from the Latinx health paradox. And those in public health might be familiar with the idea that for communities of color, their socioeconomic status can determine health outcomes, meaning that the more money you have, the better your health tends to be. But for Latinas, despite our class, our health was better than expected. Well, COVID changed that, as you see here in the bottom right. And in these 3 headlines from 2020 to 2022, showing that Black and Latinx people, even young and non-disabled ones, were dying at a higher rate than white people. Of course, as the quote by Aurora Levins Morales taught us earlier, the way illness and disability is distributed is not accidental. And the way many white people stop taking precautions when they learn of this is not surprising. But why did us as Latinx people join? So there's many critiques to be made to the systems that contribute to oppression and the distribution of death and disability. And just seeing these headlines, we see issues of vaccine distribution, risk associated with labor, and the underlying racism of it all. Because each one of these issues requires attention, and we actually don't have enough time to go in detail, I am more interested in what each one of us can do and what we can do together, of course. So that's why I want you to look at this graph of the pandemic from 2020 until 2025. This was actually published last week on Instagram by Michael Herger, who's the director of the Health Psychology Doctorate Program, and also has created this pandemic mitigation collaborative where you can see wastewater data. And they use CDC data, but even though they have changed over time, like not all tests get reported. This is like from wastewater, so it's the virus that people are just sharing. So one of the things that you see is there has been 11 waves of the pandemic. We're currently at the peak of the 11th one. So when did the pandemic end for you and for your loved one? And then I also love that he included during COVID in each one of the waves. So I'm also assuming that there's people like me in the audience that don't believe the pandemic ended and continue taking precautions for them and their communities. So I know we have accumulated a lot of different griefs in the last 5 years or more, but I also want to think about the harm we can do when we ignore the many waves of infection and their consequences. And so far, you might be thinking, where is disability justice in all of this? With 1.3 million daily infections estimated by Michael Herger during COVID is today, not just 2020. Herger estimates this week that between 2,500 and 4,200 deaths will result from this week's infection. And if we're here, we know that disability can also be an outcome of infection and can make other disabilities worse. And just to summarize, tons of research on COVID since 2020 is one of like the most researched illnesses, and horribly, like what has been found is not great. COVID increases the risk of cancer and other illnesses and affects many organs, including our brain, as well as disrupts our immune system. So who benefits from increasing death and disability in communities of color? And who are we willing to sacrifice? Are we part of the vulnerable? Or how do we decide that we are not? So of course, this takes us to what I was saying before about like how we define disability and whose problem we think disability is. So probably a lot of you are familiar with the medical model that explains disability in terms of abnormal states of the body and mind themselves. It assumes that the limitations faced by people with disabilities are the consequence from their difference, the difference in their body. The medical model is rarely defended explicitly, but aspects of it are often adopted without thinking. We all do it sometimes, especially in healthcare settings and other places where people ignore or underestimate the contribution of social and other environmental factors to the limitations faced by people with disabilities, or disabled people, as I would prefer. In contrast, the social model explains disability in terms of a relation between an individual and her environment. The exclusion of people with certain physical and mental characteristics or impairments from major domains of social life. Their exclusion is manifested not only in deliberative separation, but in environments that build and organize social activity that restrict the participation of people who are seen or labeled as disabled, because sometimes you don't necessarily need to identify as disabled like to be excluded. So there's many social models of disability scholars and activists. And while these two models that I just showed you are not mutually exclusive, they might help us understand to how we're thinking about disability in COVID times. And so when we're thinking about disability advocacy and activism, we usually think about disability rights. And I'm very grateful I'm presenting after Elisa Flores, since now you know more about the history of disability rights and the importance of disability justice. But just to summarize, this infographic from Disability Justice at San Jose State University is useful to understand the difference between disability rights and disability justice. It is divided in two parts. The left side is about disability rights and the right side about disability justice. On the left, you see an icon of a man in a wheelchair, and he's wearing a surgical mask and looking at his phone. On the right, there's an icon of a woman in a wheelchair. The background depicts her in a room with a desk, bookshelf, potted plant, and window, and she's looking at a laptop on the desk. So while the disability rights movement is about laws to prevent discrimination regardless of disability status, the purpose of disability justice is like to create to work together to create an intersectional movement to achieve true equality. And while disability rights are possible because of institutions and governments, disability justice is created through the works of activists, organizers, and cultural workers. One of the main critiques to the disability rights movement is that its leaders have been primarily white people with mobility impairments. And disability justice was actually created in response to this by disabled people of color, peers with disabilities, people with disabilities who are incarcerated, amongst others. But since invalid is the collective that is usually invoked when we talk about disability justice and its principles. So if in the disability rights movement, the goal is to provide legally required accommodations for people with a defined medical disability, for disability justice is to provide an intersectional framework to dismantle systems of exploitation. So for disability rights, this goal is created by working within the current system to make reasonable accommodations for disabled people. But in disability justice is about redesigning, reimagining entire systems to root out ableism, racism, homophobia, capitalism, racism, transmisogyny, police violence, excessive imprisonment, etc. In some, disability rights is about what is. Disability justice is about what could be. And because of this, disability rights, as it exists now, doesn't necessarily challenge any structural oppression except for disability. And in the process, it makes invisible many people's particular lives. Disability justice challenges the idea that our worth as individuals has to do with our ability to work or perform as productive members of society. And it insists that our worth is inherent and tied to the liberation of all beings. Like transformative justice, reproductive justice, and environmental justice, it implies working together, creating a movement and strategies and anti-capitalist critique. That said, a lot of times we use disability justice, especially in academics and consultants contexts, to advance careers and less to amplifying or listening to the voice of disabled and queer people of color that are actually part of the movement. So we have here the 10 principles of disability justice, and Elisa already shared a bit about this. But the idea is that we know that each person has many identities, and sometimes those identities are related to privilege or oppression, right? So depending to the ways we interact with institutions and other people, the way our disability exists socially is always being shaped by race, by gender, by class, by gender expression, and in our specific space within a hierarchy, right? So the second principle is it reflects that an understanding of like ableism as connected to other systemic oppressions. And as Levin's model says, we are led by those who most know these systems. And disability justice also shares the two next principles with other justice-based movements, the anti-capitalist politic and the commitment to cross-movement organizing. Disabled bodies resist to capitalist and normative and productive standards. And in a system that sees land and humans and some non-human beings as well as objects of profit, then thinking outside of that logic makes it possible even like to work with other social movements, right? The fifth principle is recognizing wholeness, right? Meaning that we value people as they are, for who they are, and outside of capitalism as well. In terms of sustainability, we think about the importance of like pacing ourselves, right? Individually and collective, to think about long-term goals and working towards justice and liberation together. Which takes us to commitment to cross-disability solidarity, and is instead of like relying of hierarchies of like who's more or less disabled and who can do or not do things, the idea is like to break ableist and patriarchal and racist and class isolation, and to work together, right? Instead of isolating ourselves. Interdependence is one of my favorites because I think that, especially in disability rights, the idea of like independence is very valued and in some cases very useful. But in this case, we think about community as important, right? And this is specifically useful for Black and brown people who not only sees other living beings, including non-human beings, but the land also as central to the liberation of our own community. The ninth principle is collective access. And the idea is that we can engage flexibly and creatively with each other and create new ways of doing things that go beyond able-bodied minded normativity. So access needs are not about shame or favors. Access needs are not a burden. we can share responsibility for access needs. And collective liberation, right? The idea is like, how do we move together so no one is left behind? So this framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have needs, even able-bodied ones, and we have skills and we have strength and we are powerful, and not in spite of disabilities, but because of them. And at the same time, like that our bodies are constructed constantly by sexuality and class and all the things that we talked about. Right? So how can we use disability justice and its 10 principles to navigate Latinx criminalization, right? These are headlines about increased ICE activity and protests in response to this in the just last 24 hours. With a budget larger than most countries' military's budget, we know that we're living in unprecedented times in terms of migrant criminalization. And there's a lot of research and reporting on how incarceration increases outbreaks of infectious disease and in turn are tools of disablement. These articles are just from this year, and the bottom two are like from last month. But yeah, there's many examples of this. You probably already know on September 8th, the Supreme Court lifted a restraining order from a judge in LA who had restricted Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agents from conducting stops without reasonable suspicion. Sonia Sotomayor condemned the vote in a 21-page dissent the same day. And this is a quote from that dissent. We should not have to live in a country where the government can seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job. So it's probably no surprise for anyone here that the Latin American diaspora has been specifically targeted by us. Lorenzo Antonio Batres Vargas, a 32-year-old Mexican man who had lived in Flagstaff, Arizona his whole life, died on August 31st while in custody, ICE custody, at the state Central Arizona Correctional Complex. He had been in custody for 3 weeks. In his GoFundMe, a family member wrote, a beloved son, brother, and friend who passed away far too soon at the age of 32. His passing is a tragedy compounded by the circumstances under which he died alone, likely from complication of COVID-19 and without the medical attention that he deserved. He's the 13th person to die in ICE custody since the Trump administration began. So what would it look like to not just advocate for access and disability rights based on what the law currently is? And you probably get now why we looked at this graph from COVID earlier. Yesterday, an attorney who represents migrants at the Otay Detention Center in Southern California denounced overcrowding and how this is currently fueling a COVID outbreak that has lasted several weeks. So this is what is, right? This is what is legal actually right now. But legality does not equal morality, as history has taught us over and over. So what could justice look like if we commit to mitigate infections for those in our communities more affected and most at risk from COVID deaths and disability? And now what? And like I said, I get this question a lot. And while I hope you remember the importance of informing yourself and remind yourself who benefits or gets harmed with the narratives and actions of your everyday life as COVID continues to spread as asymptomatically often and leaves a wake of chronic health conditions, even after so-called mild cases. And of course, I want you all to consider masking and testing and cleaning the air. But I also don't want to be prescriptive about guidelines on moving forward or to give you an easy DIY disability justice recipe to tie all of this with a nice little bow at the end. Instead, I want to end with an invitation. Know your values, know your skills, inform yourself, and look around locally and within your communities to see what's going on. So here I have some examples of what I've seen in my own community. Information sharing and education happening outside institutions, like this post from Long COVID Justice here on Instagram, reminding us that we're still in a global airborne pandemic that affects everyone. In response, collective care is taught as masking and event plan. We also have art, of course, in Invalid, the queer disabled performance groups that came up with the 10 disability justice principles, but also my friend and Maryland neighbor, Radical Birding, that through photos of birds and illustrations reminds us of masking as love and collective care. And because people tend to think that mitigation is incompatible with events, we also have examples of clean air libraries, which are lending libraries that exist in many cities where anyone can borrow an air purifier and learn why cleaning the air is part of accessibility. And finally, mask blogs that also exist in many cities where anyone can access masks and tests for free. And what these mutual aid groups remind us is that all we have is each other. So what does disability justice and collective care look like for you and your communities? What could justice look like if our solidarity included the recognition of our interdependence? And what do we owe to the most vulnerable in our community? And yes, please let me know, but also thank you and gracias. And yeah, feel free to share any questions right now or contact me later after you process all of this.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Does anybody have any questions? If not, the email address is right. Oh, I think we do. How can we support each other?
I mean, I think it depends, right? And that's why I feel like it's going to look different for every community, and I think that's why I feel like I learned so much, like from my students and like from local organizers, because people are coming up with ways of like filling the gaps of like what institutions and the state is not providing. And yeah, it's going to look different. I feel that sometimes it's fundraising, sometimes it's like, yeah, GoFundMe for a family. And sometimes it's about just doing what you can, right? Like for the people around you, for your neighbors, know your neighbors, see what they need, make an emergency action plan, like for when ice comes or like when a disaster happens, right? Like we've seen like how climate disaster is happening in different ways for different communities, and sometimes because we are so individualistic in the US, we tend to forget like what is happening in our communities and the way maybe like previous generations in Latin America were organizing themselves and were taking care of each other. Mhm.
Let's see, another question. Any recommendations on when to speak up?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, I would say that even like for me, it took a while, right? Like I said, I'm chronically ill since childhood, and even like speaking up for myself, like in medical uh, settings, has taken different shapes, and sometimes like you need to start easy in spaces like where you don't feel as scared and where you know that people are going to be supportive, and then like try to increase like the difficulty. But sometimes it's just like bring someone to support you, and find your people. I feel a lot of this like organizing and finding community is realizing that not all communities can give you everything. So sometimes like you need to find like your disability community and your immigrant community, and have different spaces like where you can practice and learn from other people, so you can use that information in places where like sometimes you're the only one. And I imagine that maybe that's what came to mind. I've been sometimes the only disabled one in a space, or like the only Latina one in a space, and that comes sometimes with the responsibility for speaking on behalf of the whole community. So trying to find spaces where that's not always the case is also important as well.
Sure. Well, we have time for one more question. How can we build cross-movement solidarity between immigrant rights, racial justice, and disability justice work?
That's good. I mean, I would say that it's already happening. So that's why my invitation was to know your values and know your skills, but also like look around, pay attention to see what's already going on. Because sometimes like we want to build the thing that doesn't exist, and that's super important, and we need to continue doing that. And at the same time, like sometimes we can join forces with people who are already doing the type of work that we think is needed, right? And because of this idea that we need to pace ourselves, right? Like our bodies and our energies are not endless. I think that maybe that's why I think that this is collective work, and it's also work worth doing with other people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. As we're going to wrap up day one. So as we wrap day one, I want to thank each of our speakers, panelists, sponsors, and all of you for your energy and engagement. Please take a moment to complete our feedback questionnaire about today's session. The link is in the chat, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. A Spanish version is also linked in the chat. Tomorrow, we'll be back at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for another afternoon of learning and connection. Please check your Eventbrite event page for tomorrow's agenda and links. Thank you for being a part of this wonderful community where we can celebrate diversity and amplify each other's voices. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.